London, November 1985. Michael Caine stood in the grand entrance hall of his Belgravia mansion, watching James Whitmore polish the silver tea service with the same meticulous attention to detail he had shown every morning for the past 15 years. At 63, James was the epitome of the perfect English butler, impeccably dressed, utterly professional, and so thoroughly integrated into the household routine that Michael rarely gave much thought to his personal life or background. But on this particular gray November morning, a chance discovery was about to shatter everything Michael thought he knew about the quiet, dignified man who had been running his household with flawless efficiency for a decade and a half. Because what Michael was about to uncover would reveal that James wasn't just an exceptionally skilled domestic employee, he was one of the wealthiest men in Britain, living in deliberate obscurity while serving a master who had no idea he was actually in the presence of nobility. Michael had purchased the Belgravia house in 1970, following his success in Get Carter and The Italian Job. The Georgian townhouse built in 1847 was exactly the kind of elegant London residence that proclaimed its owner's arrival in the upper echelons of British society. With its 5 floors, 12 bedrooms, formal dining room, library, and staff quarters, it was a home that demanded professional household management. James Whitmore had answered Michael's advertisement for a butler in the Times in September 1970. His credentials were impeccable. He had served in the Royal Navy for 22 years, rising to the rank of Chief Petty Officer, and had subsequently worked in several distinguished households. His references were glowing, his manner was perfect, and his understanding of household management was comprehensive and sophisticated. "I require a position where I can utilize my organizational skills and my understanding of proper household protocols," James had explained during his interview. "I believe in running a home with dignity, efficiency, and discretion." Michael had been impressed immediately. Here was someone who understood not just the technical aspects of managing a large household, but the subtleties of creating an atmosphere of comfort and refinement that would allow Michael to focus on his career without worrying about domestic concerns. Over the 15 years since that first meeting, James had exceeded every expectation. He managed Michael's calendar with military precision, coordinated with Michael's agents and publicists, supervised the other household staff, and somehow anticipated Michael's needs before Michael himself was aware of them. When Michael traveled for filming, James ensured that everything at home continued to operate smoothly. When Michael entertained, which he did frequently, given his growing status in the film industry, James orchestrated dinner parties that were legendary for their elegance and flawless execution. But perhaps most importantly, James had become a trusted confidant. In the often chaotic and superficial world of entertainment, James represented stability, wisdom, and complete loyalty. Michael had come to rely on their morning conversations over coffee, during which James would brief him on the day's schedule while offering thoughtful observations about everything from current events to career decisions. James has become much more than an employee. Michael often told friends, "He's become a friend, an advisor, and probably the most consistently reliable person in my life." What Michael didn't know was that James's life before entering domestic service was far more complex and privileged than anything indicated in his employment application. The truth began to emerge on that November morning when Michael returned unexpectedly to the house to retrieve some scripts he'd forgotten for a lunch meeting with director John Huston. James was in the library, carefully cataloging some new books that had arrived, and he didn't hear Michael enter through the kitchen door. As Michael headed upstairs to his study, he passed James's modest quarters on the ground floor, a comfortable but simple bedroom, sitting area, and private bathroom that James had occupied for 15 years. The door was slightly ajar, and Michael glanced in reflexively, intending perhaps to say hello. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. On James's small writing desk was an open leather portfolio containing what appeared to be financial documents. Even from a distance, Michael could see letterheads from prestigious investment banks, and the figures visible on the pages were substantial, not thousands or even tens of thousands, but numbers that suggested wealth on an entirely different scale. Michael's first thought was that James might be managing investments for a former employer, or perhaps handling financial matters for relatives. But something about the formal layout of the documents suggested they were more personal than that. Without thinking, Michael stepped closer to the door. What he saw confused him even more. Among the financial documents were photographs, not family snapshots, but formal portraits of the kind taken for official purposes. And in those photographs, James appeared to be wearing formal military dress uniforms with decorations that suggested rank and recognition far beyond what Michael had understood about his Navy service. But most puzzling of all was a formal document that appeared to be some kind of legal correspondence from a firm Michael recognized as one of London's most exclusive estate law practices, the kind that typically handled matters for the aristocracy and the extremely wealthy. Michael stood in the hallway trying to process what he'd seen. The James Whitmore he knew was a former Navy man who had chosen domestic service as a respectable career after military retirement. He lived modestly, saved carefully, and had never given any indication of wealth or privileged background. But the documents and photographs suggested something entirely different. Michael retreated to his study, retrieved his scripts, and left for his lunch meeting. But he couldn't concentrate on John Huston's discussion of their upcoming project. His mind kept returning to what he glimpsed in James's quarters. That evening, over their customary pre-dinner conversation in the library, Michael found himself studying James with new eyes. Everything about the man's bearing, his vocabulary, his cultural references, his instinctive understanding of social protocols, it all suggested an education and background far more privileged than what Michael had assumed. "James," Michael said carefully, "in all our years together I realize I know very little about your background before you entered service." James set down his coffee cup with characteristic precision. "I've always believed, sir, that my personal history is less important than my ability to fulfill my current responsibilities effectively." "Of course," Michael agreed. "But I'm curious. Your understanding of art, literature, music, it's quite sophisticated. Did you have formal education in these areas?" "I was fortunate to receive a comprehensive education in my youth," James replied diplomatically. Michael sensed that James was being deliberately vague, but he didn't want to press the issue directly. Instead, he decided to do some discreet investigation of his own. The next morning, while James was at the market, Michael made some phone calls. He started with the employment agency that had originally recommended James, but their records from 15 years earlier were minimal. He tried the references James had provided, but most of the telephone numbers were no longer in service. Finally, Michael called his own solicitor, Jeffrey Morrison, who had been handling Michael's legal affairs for years and had excellent connections throughout London's professional establishment. "Jeffrey," Michael said, "I need you to do me a favor. I want you to research someone named James Whitmore, former Royal Navy, entered domestic service around 1970. "Any particular reason?" Jeffrey asked. "Just curiosity about someone who's been important in my life. I'd like to understand his background better." Jeffrey called back 3 hours later with information that left Michael speechless. "Michael," Jeffrey said, his voice containing a mixture of surprise and amusement, "your James Whitmore is rather more than he appears to be." "What do you mean?" "James Edward Whitmore is the third Lord Ashford, heir to one of the oldest estates in Oxfordshire. His family has held the title since 1623. He inherited the lordship in approximately £47 million when his father died in 1969. Michael felt as if the floor had dropped out from under him. "That's impossible. James has been my butler for 15 years. He lives in a small room in my house. He earns £500 a month. According to my sources," Jeffrey continued, "Lord Ashford disappeared from society shortly after inheriting his title. He sold the family estate to the National Trust, liquidated most of his assets, and simply vanished from his previous life. There was considerable speculation about what had happened to him, but no one knew where he'd gone." Michael hung up the phone in a state of complete bewilderment. The man who had been polishing his silver and coordinating his social calendar was actually a lord with a fortune that dwarfed Michael's own considerable wealth. That evening, Michael decided to confront James directly. "James," he said after dinner, "we need to have a conversation, a completely honest conversation." James's expression didn't change, but Michael detected a slight tension in his posture. "Of course, sir. What would you like to discuss?" "I think you know what I want to discuss. Lord Ashford." The silence that followed was unlike anything that had ever existed between them. James stood perfectly still for what seemed like an eternity, then slowly sat down in the chair opposite Michael. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly. "I found out today." "James, why didn't you tell me? Why have you been living this way for 15 years? James was quiet for a long moment, clearly deciding how much to reveal. Because, sir, I discovered that being Lord Ashford made me profoundly unhappy, while being James Whitmore has brought me more satisfaction and peace than I ever experienced as a titled gentleman. Michael leaned forward. I don't understand. When I inherited the title and the estate, James began, I also inherited a life that felt completely empty to me. I was surrounded by people who were interested in my wealth and position, but no one who cared about me as an individual. I attended social events where the conversation was vapid and the relationships were purely transactional. James's voice grew stronger as he continued. I had a staff of 37 people managing my estate, but I had no real purpose, no meaningful work to do, no sense that my existence mattered to anyone. I was Lord Ashford, but I wasn't really living. Michael was fascinated by this perspective. So you decided to become a butler. I decided to become useful, James corrected. I wanted to work, to contribute something meaningful to someone's life, to be valued for what I could do rather than what I had inherited. James explained that he had spent months researching different career possibilities before settling on domestic service. I realized that managing a household well requires every skill I had developed: organizational ability, attention to detail, understanding of social protocols, financial management, and the ability to anticipate needs and solve problems. But most importantly, it would allow me to work directly with people in a way that actually mattered. But James, Michael said, you could have done anything. Charity work, politics, business investment. Why choose to be a servant? James smiled for the first time since the conversation had begun. Because being a servant to someone I respect isn't degrading, it's honorable. When I manage your household, when I coordinate your schedule, when I create an environment that allows you to focus on your creative work, I'm contributing to something meaningful. Your films bring pleasure and entertainment to millions of people. By supporting your work, I'm part of something worthwhile. Michael felt his understanding of class, work, and value being completely reconfigured by this conversation. But don't you miss the wealth? The status, the freedom that comes with having £47 million. I kept the wealth, James said quietly. I still have access to my inheritance, but I discovered that having money and being defined by money are two entirely different things. James explained that he had set up a complex system of trusts and investments that allowed him to live comfortably while using most of his wealth for charitable purposes. I donate approximately £2 million a year to various causes: and education for working-class children, housing for veterans, medical research, arts funding. The money does far more good when it's being used to help people than it ever did when it was simply establishing my social status. Michael was overwhelmed by the implications of what he was learning. James, you've been working for me for 15 years while secretly donating millions to charity. The work isn't secret from the charity. They know exactly where the funding comes from. But I prefer that my professional life remains separate from my philanthropic activities. And you've been living on a butler's salary while you could afford to buy half of London. I've been living on a butler's salary because that's the work I've chosen to do, and that's what the work pays. The inheritance is a separate matter. Michael sat back in his chair, trying to process this completely new understanding of the man he'd thought he knew so well. James, this changes everything between us. Does it? James asked. I'm still the same person I was this morning. I still perform the same work with the same dedication. I still value our friendship and our working relationship. The only thing that's changed is what you know about my financial circumstances. Michael considered this carefully. But I've been paying you £500 a month to manage a household while you have £47 million in the bank. Don't you see how that makes me feel? How does it make you feel? Confused, embarrassed, like I've been taking advantage of you without knowing it. James leaned forward earnestly. Sir, you've never taken advantage of me. You've given me exactly what I wanted. Meaningful work, a clear purpose, and a professional relationship based on mutual respect. The fact that I don't need the salary doesn't change the value of the work or the satisfaction I derive from doing it well. But James, you could hire people to manage your charitable work. You could travel, pursue hobbies, live however you want. Why continue working as a butler? Because this is how I want to live. This work gives my life structure and meaning. Your household has become my home in a way that Ashford Manor never was. Our professional relationship has evolved into a friendship that I treasure more than any of the social connections I had as Lord Ashford." James paused, then continued with obvious emotion in his voice. "When I was Lord Ashford, people deferred to my title and my wealth, but no one actually respected me as an individual. You respect me for my competence, my reliability, my judgment. That respect is worth more to me than any amount of money." Michael was quiet for several minutes, absorbing the full implications of James's explanation. "James," he said finally, "what do you want me to do with this information? How do you want our relationship to proceed?" "I would like it to proceed exactly as it has," James replied. "I would like to continue managing your household, supporting your career, and being your friend. The only difference is that now you understand my motivations more completely." Michael nodded slowly. "But James, I can't continue paying you a butler's salary knowing what I know now." "Then don't pay me at all," James said immediately. "I'll continue the work because I value it, not because I need the income. That doesn't feel right either." They spent the next hour discussing various arrangements before settling on a solution that satisfied both of them. Michael would continue paying James's salary, but James would donate it directly to charities of Michael's choosing, making Michael a partner in his philanthropic activities. "This way," James explained, "you're not taking advantage of my financial situation, and I'm not working for free. We're both contributing to causes we care about." The arrangement marked the beginning of a new phase in their relationship. Michael gained deep insight into charitable work and became actively involved in selecting and supporting various causes. James was able to share his philanthropic interests and knowledge with someone he trusted and respected. But perhaps more significantly, their friendship deepened as the artificial barriers created by their employer-employee relationship were replaced by mutual understanding and shared values. "I learned something important from James," Michael reflected years later. "I learned that true satisfaction comes not from having money, but from using whatever resources you have, whether they're financial, professional, or personal, to contribute something meaningful to the world." The story of James's hidden identity gradually became known among Michael's close friends and colleagues, and it had a profound impact on how many of them thought about wealth, work, and class distinctions. "James challenged every assumption I had about social hierarchy," director John Huston told Michael after meeting James at a dinner party. "Here was a man with a title and a fortune who had chosen to work with his hands and serve others. It made me reconsider what it means to live a meaningful life." The relationship between Michael and James continued for another 12 years, until James's death in 1997. In his will, James left his remaining fortune to a charitable foundation that he and Michael had established together, with Michael serving as chairman of the board. "James taught me that the most important question isn't how much money you have," Michael said at James's memorial service, "but what you choose to do with whatever you've been given." He had inherited wealth and privilege, but he chose to use them in service of others. That's not just admirable, Lundier. It's inspiring. Today, the Whitmore Foundation continues to support education, veteran services, and arts programs throughout Britain. And Michael still maintains the household routines that James established, finding in their structure and purpose a daily reminder of the man who taught him that true nobility comes not from what you inherit, but from how you choose to live. But the full impact of James's revelation extended far beyond their personal relationship. The story of Lord Ashford choosing to live as a butler became a powerful example that influenced how Michael approached his own wealth and success. "Before I learned about James's true background," Michael reflected in a 1995 interview, "I had always felt somewhat guilty about my wealth, uncertain whether I deserved it or was using it wisely. James showed me that wealth itself isn't the issue, it's what you choose to do with it that matters." This understanding led Michael to become much more actively involved in charitable work. He established scholarship programs for working-class students pursuing careers in the arts, funded housing projects for elderly actors, and created endowments for regional theaters throughout Britain. "James taught me that having money brings responsibility," Michael explained. "Not just the responsibility to manage it well, but the responsibility to use it in ways that benefit others." The relationship between Michael and James also influenced how Michael thought about work and career satisfaction. Watching James find profound fulfillment in household management made Michael reconsider what constituted meaningful employment. "I realized that James had achieved something I was still striving for," Michael said. He had found work that gave his life structure and purpose, work that he loved independently of any external rewards. That's something most people never find, regardless of how much money they make. This insight affected Michael's choice of film projects in the years following James's revelation. He began gravitating toward roles that offered creative challenges rather than just commercial success, working with directors like Woody Allen and Neil Jordan on projects that explored complex themes and character development. The conversation with James about finding meaningful work made me think more carefully about what kinds of stories I wanted to tell, Michael observed. I started choosing roles that would allow me to grow as an actor rather than just ones that would be commercially successful. The story of James's hidden identity also had a profound impact on other members of Michael's household staff. When word gradually spread among the domestic workers who served wealthy families throughout London, it changed how many of them viewed their own work and their relationships with their employers. "Learning about Mr. Whitmore made me proud of what I do," said Margaret Stevens, who worked as a housekeeper for several prominent families. "He showed us that domestic work isn't something to be ashamed of. It's skilled, important work that contributes to people's lives in meaningful ways." James's example inspired other wealthy individuals to reconsider their own relationships with work and service. Several of Michael's friends, upon learning the story, began volunteering for charitable organizations or taking on roles that allowed them to contribute more directly to society. James's story challenged the assumption that wealthy people should live lives of leisure, said producer David Putnam, who knew both Michael and James. He demonstrated that everyone benefits from having meaningful work regardless of their financial circumstances. The philosophical implications of James's choice to live as a butler while secretly maintaining his fortune also sparked discussions among economists and social theorists about the nature of class, work, and social mobility. Dr. Margaret Collins, a sociologist at Cambridge University who studied class dynamics in Britain, wrote extensively about James's case in her 1990 book Hidden Hierarchies: Class and Identity in Modern Britain. Lord Ashford's decision to live as a butler represents a fascinating inversion of traditional class expectations, Dr. Collins wrote. By choosing to work in service while maintaining his wealth in secret, he challenged both the assumption that manual work is inherently inferior to inherited privilege and the notion that people are defined by their financial circumstances. The story also influenced how Michael approached his relationships with other employees and service providers. He became known throughout the entertainment industry for treating everyone from movie extras to restaurant servers with exceptional respect and consideration. Michael learned from James that every person's work has dignity and value, observed director John Huston. You could see it in how he interacted with crew members, how he spoke to waiters, how he acknowledged everyone who contributed to his projects. James had taught him something fundamental about human equality. This attitude affected the atmosphere on Michael's film sets, where his respectful treatment of all cast and crew members became legendary. Directors sought him out not just for his acting abilities but because they knew his presence would create a positive working environment for everyone involved. Michael set a tone of mutual respect that made everyone feel valued, said cinematographer Douglas Slocum, who worked with Michael on several films. It didn't matter whether you were the star or someone holding lights. Michael treated you with the same courtesy and professionalism. That came from James's influence. The friendship between Michael and James also provided both men with intellectual companionship that enriched their later years. James's classical education and broad cultural knowledge complemented Michael's practical intelligence and industry experience, creating conversations that neither man could have enjoyed with anyone else. "Our evening discussions became the highlight of my day," Michael said. James had read everything, understood history and philosophy in ways that gave context to current events, but he was also fascinated by the creative process of filmmaking and the business of entertainment. We educated each other. These conversations influenced Michael's approach to his craft, as James's insights into literature and human nature informed Michael's character development and performance choices. "James helped me understand the literary sources that many screenwriters drew from," Michael explained. "When I was preparing for Educating Rita, James and I spent hours discussing the play's themes and the character relationships. His perspective on class dynamics and education was invaluable." The revelation about James's true identity also changed how Michael entertained guests in his home. Instead of the typical Hollywood gatherings focused on industry gossip and deal-making, Michael's dinner parties became known for their intellectual depth and genuine conversation. Michael's dinner parties were unique, recalled actress Maggie Smith. You might find yourself discussing philosophy with the butler, who turned out to know more about Aristotle than most university professors. It created an atmosphere where everyone felt comfortable being themselves rather than playing their public personas. These gatherings became legendary among London's cultural elite, attracting writers, artists, scholars, and politicians who were drawn by the promise of substantive conversation and James's remarkable ability to facilitate discussions that brought out the best in everyone present. James had a gift for asking exactly the right question to deepen a conversation, observed author Graham Greene, who was a regular guest. He understood how to draw people out without making them feel interrogated, how to challenge ideas without being confrontational. It was masterful social orchestration. As James aged, his relationship with Michael evolved into something closer to that of a mentor and student. James's wisdom about life, gained through his unique experience of both extreme privilege and deliberate simplicity, provided guidance for Michael's own personal development. James taught me that happiness isn't about accumulating things or achieving status, Michael reflected. It's about finding work that engages your abilities, relationships that challenge and support you, and ways to contribute something meaningful to the world. This philosophy influenced how Michael approached his later career, leading him to take on more challenging roles, support experimental filmmakers, and use his celebrity status to advocate for causes he believed in. The example James set of someone who had everything by conventional standards but chose a different path gave me permission to make choices based on personal fulfillment rather than external expectations, Michael said. The bond between Michael and James also provided both men with a model of friendship that transcended traditional social boundaries. Their relationship proved that genuine connection could develop between people of different backgrounds when it was based on mutual respect, shared values, and common interests. Our friendship showed me that class distinctions are artificial constructs that prevent people from really knowing each other, Michael observed. When you strip away assumptions about wealth, education, and social position, what matters is character, intelligence, and kindness. When James died in 1997, the funeral was attended by people from across the spectrum of British society, former colleagues from his Navy service, other domestic workers he had mentored, wealthy philanthropists who had worked with him on charitable projects, and celebrities who had been touched by his wisdom and kindness. The diversity of mourners at James's funeral told the story of his life better than any eulogy could, Michael said. He had touched people from every walk of life because he saw value and dignity in everyone he met. The memorial service revealed the full scope of James's charitable work, as representatives from dozens of organizations spoke about his contributions. Educational programs, medical research projects, housing initiatives, and arts organizations had all benefited from his quiet generosity. We learned that day that James had been personally funding the education of over 200 children from disadvantaged backgrounds, Michael revealed. He had been doing it for decades, following their progress through school and university, attending their graduations when possible. None of us had known. The revelation of James's extensive charitable activities inspired Michael to expand his own philanthropic efforts, eventually leading to the establishment of the Michael Caine Foundation, which continues many of the programs that James had supported. When Michael Caine discovered that his butler was a millionaire in disguise, he learned that the most valuable things in life, friendship, purpose, respect, and the satisfaction of meaningful work, can't be bought with money, but they can be lost if money becomes more important than the relationships and principles that give life meaning. James Whitmore had given up a fortune to find happiness, and in doing so he had shown Michael that the greatest wealth comes from understanding what truly matters and having the courage to live according to those values, regardless of what others might think or expect.